They tell you the desert is where memory goes to die. Sand buries everything, cities, bones, intentions. Give it enough centuries, and there is nothing left but the wind and the shape of dunes that never hold still. I used to believe that. I spent 41 years in the Adhem Flat, and I believed it the way you believe in gravity, not because anyone proved it to you, but because everything you have ever seen confirms it. Then the Tesseri came back, and I learned that the desert is not where memory dies, it is where memory waits. My name is Halim Soresh. I was 73 years old the day the alert reached my station, a ninth watch analyst on extended post-retirement contract, which is a polite way of saying I was the old man they kept around, because no one else wanted to sit in a monitoring bunker at the edge of a weapons range and watch sensor feeds that had not changed in living memory. The Adhem Flat stretches 1,100 kilometers across what the old maps called the Western Sahara, though that name means nothing now. It is a defense range. The ground beneath it is laced with deep-bore thermal lances and kinetic silos, the sky above it threaded with relay satellites that feed into the third meridian defense lattice. But to the eye it is simply sand, tan and copper and pale gold, depending on the hour, and above it a sky so clear you can see the lattice stations catching sunlight at noon, bright as slow-moving stars. I had been alone at Station Irith for 9 days. The rotation crew was late, which happens sometimes in the dry season when the transit corridors shifted for atmospheric maintenance. I did not mind. I had my work. The Ninth Watch does not monitor threats. It monitors memory. We maintained the long archive, 30,000 years of drive signature records, departure vectors, intercept logs, and identity files for every vessel that has ever entered or exited human-controlled space. The archive is not a database in the way most people understand that word. It is a living document, maintained by an unbroken chain of analysts stretching back to the generation that built it, updated, cross-referenced, and verified by hand and by machine in alternating cycles so that neither method can corrupt the other without detection. I was one of 412 analysts assigned to the Tesseri file specifically. 412 people across 9 stations on 3 continents and 2 orbital platforms whose only job was to keep the record of a single alien fleet that had not been seen in 30,000 years. You might think that is excessive. You might think that is the kind of institutional inertia that grows in old civilizations the way barnacles grow on a hull, purposeless, residual, consuming resources out of habit. I thought so myself once, when I was young and had not yet read the primary sources. When I was 24 and fresh out of the Analytic Institute at Meridian South, I asked my supervisor, a woman named Owa Jenan, why we still maintained a live file on a fleet that was almost certainly dust. She looked at me the way you look at a child who has asked why the sea is wet. "Because they left," she said, "and anything that leaves can come back." That was the first day I understood what the Ninth Watch was for. The Tesseri struck Earth 30,000 years ago, during what the archive calls the collapse interregnum, a period of roughly 4 centuries when human civilization had contracted to a fraction of its former reach. We had overextended. Our early colonial efforts beyond the solar system had drained the homeworld's industrial base. A series of resource conflicts had fragmented the governing coalitions, and for a window of perhaps 300 years, Earth was genuinely vulnerable, not dead, not abandoned, but weakened in a way that the species had not experienced since the dark ages of its pre-spaceflight history, and weakened in a way that was visible from orbit. Reduced electromagnetic output, fewer orbital platforms, diminished traffic in the inner system. The Tesseri found that window. They were not conquerors in the grand imperial sense. The records suggest a mercantile raider confederation, multiple clan fleets operating under a shared banner of convenience, drawn to systems that showed signs of decline, the way certain animals are drawn to the scent of wounded prey. They entered the solar system in a formation of 91 vessels, conducted a series of targeted raids on orbital manufacturing platforms, stripped what they could carry, killed approximately 9,000 people in the process, and left. The entire engagement lasted 46 days. They did not occupy, they did not negotiate. They took what they wanted and moved on to the next weak system on their charts, and their exit vector carried them spinward toward a region of space that, at that time, human sensors could not track beyond a few light years. It would have been easy to forget them. 46 days out of 30,000 years is nothing. A splinter, a footnote. And in the centuries that followed, as Earth rebuilt and then surpassed everything it had been before the collapse, there were louder threats, closer enemies, and more urgent priorities. The Tesseri raid could have faded into the deep strata of historical record, studied by specialists, unknown to the public, irrelevant to defense planning. It did not fade, because the people who rebuilt Earth after the collapse made a decision that, I believe, is the most important decision the species has ever made, though it was not dramatic, and no one gave a speech about it. They decided to remember everything, not in the passive way that civilizations keep archives for scholars to browse, in the active, operational, resource-consuming way that a garrison remembers the face of every enemy that has ever approached its walls. They built the long archive. They funded the Ninth Watch. They assigned analysts to every known drive signature and departure vector, and they wrote into the charter of every defense institution that followed a single directive. Nothing that has entered this system leaves without a file, and no file is ever closed. 30,000 years. That is how long we kept the Tesseri file open. 1,142 generations of analysts, passing the record from hand to hand like a flame that no one is allowed to set down. The data format changed, the storage medium changed. The language the annotations were written in changed 3 times. The borders of the nations that funded the work changed, merged, dissolved, and reformed. But the file stayed open, and the departure vector stayed plotted, and every 20 years a senior analyst at one of the 9 stations ran a probability model on when and from where a return approach might originate, and those models were fed into the third meridian defense lattice, targeting computers, where they sat alongside 10,000 other contingency files, patiently waiting. I had run that model 6 times in my career. Each time the result was the same: return probability low but non-zero, projected approach corridor unchanged, recommended posture unchanged. Maintain the watch, so I maintained the watch. The alert came at 06:14 local time on what the civil calendar calls the 9th of Tessak, which means nothing to anyone outside the Adhem region. I was in the sensor bay reviewing a routine calibration log when the primary display shifted from its standard passive scan mode to an active track overlay, and a priority marker appeared in the upper right quadrant: deep space contact, bearing and range consistent with an approach from the spinward corridor. The system had flagged it automatically. I leaned forward and read the classification tag, and for the first time in 41 years of watching a screen that never changed, the tag read Tesseri, signature match, confidence 97. I sat with that for perhaps 10 seconds. I remember the sound of the ventilation system and the faint hum of the calibration rig I had been working on, and the quality of the morning light coming through the eastern window of the bay, which at that hour is the color of old copper. I remember thinking, Oa was right. Then I initiated the confirmation protocol. I pulled the original departure vector file. One built from sensor data recorded 30,000 years ago, annotated by analysts whose names I knew because I had read every annotation in the file at least twice, and I overlaid it on the incoming track. The geometries aligned within the model's predicted margin. I pulled the drive signature comparison and ran it against the 91 known Tesserae engine profiles from the original raid. The incoming signatures were not identical. They were descendants, the same bass harmonic, the same fuel cycle cadence, but with 30 millennia of engineering drift. The system's recognition algorithms, which had been trained on exactly this kind of drift modeling, returned a match on 63 of the 91 profiles, 63 ships, not the full fleet, but enough. I transmitted the confirmation to Meridian Central and to the 5 other Ninth Watch stations that were online at that hour, and within 90 seconds the 3rd Meridian Defense Lattice shifted from standby to active posture. Not combat posture, active. There is a difference, and the difference matters. Active posture means the targeting computers load their contingency files and begin tracking the incoming contact with weapons-grade precision, but no weapon is armed, no intercept is launched, and no vessel is scrambled. It is the posture of a civilization that has had a very long time to think about what it will do when this moment arrives, and has decided that the first thing it will do is nothing. I watched the contact resolve over the next 11 hours. The fleet was decelerating. They had dropped out of superluminal transit at the edge of the system and were approaching on sublight drives, which suggested either caution or outdated navigation protocols, or both. Their formation was loose, a broad wedge that the tactical analysts at Meridian and Central would later describe as consistent with a survey and approach posture rather than an assault configuration. They were not charging in. They were creeping the way the original Tesserae had crept in 30,000 years ago when they had been looking for weakness. I tried to imagine what their instruments were telling them as they crossed the outer markers. At the range they entered, roughly 40 astronomical units, even basic sensors would have picked up the orbital traffic. Earth runs over 600 active platforms in the inner defense shell alone, each one a self-sustaining weapons and surveillance station massing between 8 and 14 million metric tons. At full passive output, they radiate enough energy to register as a continuous band, not a scatter of individual points. To the Tesserae's navigation officer, checking his instruments, checking his instru against 30,000-year-old charts that showed a system with perhaps a dozen orbital structures, it would have looked like the star had grown a ring. As they drew closer, the resolution would have improved. The warships would have separated from the background, 4 Kethani-class patrol vessels on standard inner system station, each one a 3-kilometer blade of layered armor and directed energy arrays, holding position in a formation so precise and so still that they could be mistaken for stations until they moved. The defense lattice's relay satellites would have appeared next, a mesh so fine and so evenly distributed that no approach vector to Earth existed, without at least 200 sensor points tracking it in real time. And beneath all of that, growing clearer with every hour of their approach, the planet itself, no longer the pale blue dot their ancestors had raided, but something denser, brighter, wrapped in a visible architecture of energy and infrastructure that extended from the surface to high orbit without interruption. The first intercepted transmission came at 1422. Tesserae use a modulated pulse communication system that has not changed in its fundamental architecture since the original raid, another thing the Ninth Watch had predicted, because we had modeled their communication technologies' likely evolution alongside their drive technology, and the models said the pulse architecture was deeply embedded in their hardware manufacturing tradition and would persist. We had pre-built decryption frameworks for exactly this signal type. The translation lag was under 4 minutes. The transmission was from the fleet's lead vessel to what appeared to be a secondary command ship. I will not reproduce it verbatim. The full transcript is in the official record, and it is not my place to quote classified intercepts. But the substance was simple. The fleet commander was requesting confirmation of their navigation data. Their charts showed a world with a population of fewer than 2 billion, limited orbital infrastructure, and no significant military presence beyond the inner system. What their sensors were now showing them was something else. I have spent most of my life studying the Tesserae, and I do not claim to understand them fully. Their social structures are lateral rather than hierarchical. Their decision-making is consensus-based in a way that makes their military responses slower but more committed than ours, and their perception of time is different from ours in ways that the xenolinguists are still arguing about. But I understand enough to know what that transmission meant. It meant the fleet commander was looking at his instruments and seeing a planet that should not exist. The electromagnetic output alone would have told him. Earth in the collapse interregnum was a whisper. Earth now is a shout, a sustained, structured, planet-wide shout of energy and industry and organized power that is visible from the outer system. The orbital defense lattice would have appeared on his sensors as a continuous shell of active platforms, each one larger than his flagship. The warships holding station in high orbit, 4 of them were on routine patrol that day, each one over 3 kilometers long, would have registered as power sources larger than anything in his fleet's experience. And below all of that, the cities. Meridian South alone covers an area that the old maps would have called most of Western Europe, and it is one of 9 primary urban centers on the surface. The Tesserae's charts showed scattered settlements and dark continents. What their sensors showed them was a world that glowed. The second intercepted transmission came 19 minutes later. It was from the secondary command ship to the rest of the fleet, and its content was a single navigational query, requesting confirmation of the system coordinates. They were checking whether they were in the right place. They could not reconcile what they were seeing with what their records told them should be here. A third transmission followed an hour after that, and this one was different in character. It was addressed to all vessels in the fleet simultaneously, and the translation team at Meridian Central flagged it a consensus query, the Tesserae equivalent of a vote. The question, rendered in the flattest possible translation, was whether to continue the approach or reverse course. The vote was not unanimous. 37 vessels voted to reverse, 26 voted to continue to the inner system boundary and attempt a formal contact. The consensus threshold required 40 ships to agree, so neither option carried. The fleet continued its approach by default, which is how Tesserae consensus governance handles deadlock. Forward momentum is preserved until a supermajority actively overrides it. It is a dangerous system. It meant that 26 ships had voted to fly closer to a planet that was clearly not what they expected, and the rest had simply not voted hard enough to stop them. I watched the vote tally populate on my screen and thought about the Tesserae commander on the lead vessel watching the same numbers, knowing that his fleet was divided and drifting toward a world that his instruments were telling him could destroy them without effort. I wondered whether he was afraid. I wondered whether fear felt the same to a Tesseri as it does to a man sitting alone in a desert monitoring station at the edge of the Adhem Flat. I listened to those transmissions in the sensor bay at Station Irith, with the desert light coming through the window and the sand outside, and the silence of the Adhem Flat all around me, and I felt something I had not expected to feel. Not satisfaction, not pride. Grief, a grief so old and so deep that it surprised me, because I had not known it was there until that moment. The way you do not know, the weight of a thing you have carried your whole life until someone asks you to set it down. I grieved for the 19,000, for the orbital workers and the platform crews and the civilians who died in the Tesseri's 46-day raid 30,000 years ago, whose names are in the file I have maintained since I was 24 years old. I knew their names, not all 19,000, no single analyst carries them all, but I knew my section's share, the 411 people assigned to the platforms in the third orbital band, because that was my specialty within the file. I knew their duty rosters and their communication logs and the sequence in which their platforms went dark. I had read their last transmissions, the ones that were routine status reports right up until they were not, and I grieved for every generation since, for the analysts who came before me and the ones who came before them, stretching back in an unbroken line to the first Ninth Watch officer who sat down and opened the file and said, "We will not forget this, because the cost of remembering is not dramatic. It does not make for a good story. It is a person in a room, maintaining a record year after year, while the world outside changes and grows, and forgets why the room exists. It is funding reviews and institutional arguments and the slow, grinding work of convincing each new administration that the watch is still necessary. It is the analysts who died at their posts during the Krennic quake 3,000 years ago, when Station Irith was buried under 40 meters of displaced sand and the backup team dug for 9 days to reach the archive servers because the data could not be lost. It is the translation teams who spent centuries reconstructing Tesseri linguistic drift from first principles because they had no living informants to work with. It is the quiet, unglamorous, thankless discipline of a species that decided once, 30,000 years ago, that it would never again be caught unaware, and then held to that decision across more generations than most civilizations survive. That is what the Tesseri were looking at, though they did not know it yet. Not just the cities and the warships and the defense lattice. Those were consequences. What they were looking at was the memory itself. The fact that Earth had never stopped watching, the corridor they left through had never closed the file, had never once in 30,000 years allowed the watch to lapse. The fleet held position at the outer system for 6 hours. During that time, Meridian Central convened the Response Council, which is the standing body authorized to manage contact events involving previously documented hostile actors. I was patched into the proceedings by secure relay because I was the senior Tesseri file analyst on duty, and my confirmation of the signature match was the evidentiary foundation for the Council's classification of the contact. They asked me 3 questions. Was I confident in the match? I was. Was the incoming fleet consistent in composition with a raiding force? I said it was not. The formation and signal traffic suggested a return survey, not an assault, and the fleet was significantly smaller than the original. Was there any indication in the 30,000-year file that the Tesseri had ever sent advance scouts before a larger force. I said there was not, but that the file could not rule it out, and I recommended maintaining active posture with no escalation. The Council voted to transmit. This is the part that I think about most often in the years since. Not the alert, not the signature match, not the intercepted transmissions, the transmission. Because Earth could have done many things in that moment. The defense lattice could have engaged the fleet at the outer system boundary with kinetic interdiction. The contingency file included that option, modeled and refined over millennia. The patrol warships could have moved to intercept. A warning volley could have been fired across the fleet's trajectory. All of these were in the file. All of them had been debated, modeled, voted on, revised, and retained as viable options by successive response councils going back thousands of years. Earth chose to send a message. The transmission was assembled by the Diplomatic Signals Division at Meridian Central, but its core content came from the Ninth Watch. From my file, from the files maintained by analysts at the other 8 stations, from the cumulative record of 30,000 years of patient, disciplined observation, it was not a threat, it was not a warning, it was a record. The transmission opened with the Tesserae fleet's original entry vector, from 30,000 years ago, plotted to a precision that their own navigation systems could verify. It included the drive signatures of all 91 original vessels, individually catalogued, with annotations marking which signatures had been detected in the current incoming fleet and which had not. It included the duration of the original raid, 46 days, and the inventory of what had been taken, down to the metric tonnage of refined materials stripped from each orbital platform. It included the names, 19,000 names, every person killed in the original raid, listed in the order their platforms went dark, with their duty assignments and their last recorded communications. Not as an accusation, not as a demand for justice, as a fact. Earth remembered them. Earth had always remembered them, and Earth wanted the Tesserae to know that. The transmission continued with a summary of Earth's current defensive posture, not the classified details, but enough for the Tesserae's analysts to understand the scale of what they were facing. The number of active defense platforms in the orbital lattice, the approximate displacement of the 4 patrol warships visible on their sensors, the population of the planet below, the energy output of the primary urban centers, enough for them to do the arithmetic themselves and arrive at the conclusion that Earth was not hiding behind its defenses out of fear. Earth was standing behind them out of choice. The transmission closed with a navigational escort protocol. A corridor had been calculated from the fleet's current position to the system boundary, with waypoints and timing intervals. 2 escort vessels, not warships, but armed patrol cutters, each one still larger than anything in the Tesserae fleet, would accompany them. The corridor led out. The message was clear. You may leave. You will be watched. Do not return. There was no ultimatum, no demand for surrender, no offer of negotiation. Earth did not want anything from the Tesserae. It did not want revenge, or preparations, or submission. It wanted them to know that they were known, that their ancestors' raid had not been forgotten, had not faded, had not been buried under the sand of 30 millennia, that every ship, every stolen ton, every killed worker had been recorded and maintained in a living file by a civilization that had decided, on the day of the original raid, that it would carry that memory forward for as long as it took. The Tesserae fleet began its withdrawal 14 hours after the transmission was received. The intercepted internal communications during that period are classified, but I can say that the fleet's formation tightened. They pulled into a close, defensive cluster, which is a tesserae stress response, and their drive output increased to maximum sustainable thrust. They were not fleeing in panic. Tesserae do not panic the way humans do. Their consensus-based decision-making produces a collective resolve that, once formed, does not waver. They had reached consensus, and the consensus was to leave. The vote this time was unanimous, 63-0. I imagined them reading the file we had sent. The names, the vectors, the tonnages. I imagined a tesserae officer, whatever rank structure they used, scrolling through 19,000 names, and realizing that each one had been carried, individually, across 30,000 years by a species that the tesserae's ancestors had dismissed as broken. I imagined that officer looking up from the list and looking at his own instruments. Perhaps, for the first time, that the warships and the lattice and the glowing cities were not the point. Was the list. The point was that someone had kept it. I watched them go from the sensor bay at Station Irith, 63 drive signatures, pulling away along the escort corridor, tracked by the defense lattice and by the 2 patrol cutters that flanked them at a distance that was close enough to see and far enough to be courteous. The signatures dimmed as the fleet accelerated toward the system boundary, and then, one by one, they transitioned to superluminal drive and vanished from my display. I sat in the bay for a long time after the last signature faded. The desert light had shifted from copper to the deep amber of late afternoon, and the sand outside the window was the color it gets when the sun is low. Almost the color of old rust. I thought about Oa Janane, who had died 11 years earlier at Station Karenik, and who had spent her career maintaining the same file I maintained, and who had never seen the alert she spent her life preparing for. I thought about the analyst who built the original departure vector projection, whose name was Aben Tira, and who could not have known that the projection would still be in active use 30,000 years later. I thought about the translation teams and the calibration engineers and the funding officers and the archivists and the 9-day dig after the Karenik quake, and I thought about my grandmother. She was not a Ninth Watch analyst. She was a ceramicist who worked in the cultural district of Meridian South, and she made vessels, bowls, jars, containers of various shapes, all of them functional, none of them decorative in the way that word usually means. When I was a boy, I used to sit in her workshop and watch her work the clay on a wheel that she claimed was older than she was, which I later discovered was true. The wheel had been passed down through her guild for 11 generations. She told me once, while trimming the lip of a storage jar, that the purpose of a vessel is to hold something, and the purpose of holding something is so that it is there when you need it. She was not talking about the Ninth Watch. She did not know I would join it. She was talking about a bowl she had made for storing dried herbs. But I have carried that sentence with me for 50 years. And it is the sentence I thought of when the Tesserae fleet disappeared from my screen. The long archive is a vessel. The Ninth Watch is the hands that hold it steady on the wheel. And the memory inside, the names, the vectors, the duty rosters and last transmissions, that is the thing that was there when we needed it. The purpose of holding something is so that it is there when you need it. We held the memory, not for revenge, not for glory, not to prove a point. We held it because that is what you do when you decide that what happened to you matters, and that the people it happened to deserve to be carried forward, and that the next time someone comes through that corridor, they should find not an empty world with a short memory, but a full one, a world that kept the record, a world that maintained the watch. The formal after-action review lasted 3 weeks. The tesserae file was updated, departure vector recalculated, drive signature profiles revised to incorporate the 30 millennia of observed drift, fleet composition, and behavioral analysis appended. The file was not closed. It will not be closed. Somewhere in the ninth watch, an analyst younger than I am is sitting at a station, maintaining the record, running the probability models, watching the corridor. I returned to my routine at Station Irith. The rotation crew arrived 4 days late with the usual apologies about transit delays. I briefed them on the event, handed over the active track logs, and went back to my calibration work. The desert outside was the same as it had always been. Copper in the morning, gold at noon, red in the evening, scent and silence, and the hum of sensor arrays, maintaining their vigil across a flat that stretches to the horizon in every direction. But the silence is different now. For me, it is not empty. It is full of every analyst who ever sat in a room like this one and watched a screen that did not change and maintained a file that most people thought was unnecessary because they understood something that I did not fully understand until I was 73 years old and watching a fleet of 63 ships flee from a planet they had once raided with impunity. They understood that the memory itself is the weapon, not the defense lattice, not the warships, not the kinetic silos buried under the sand. Those are the consequences of the memory. The weapon is the decision to remember, to keep the file open, to maintain the watch, to carry the names forward, to never allow the record to lapse. Because a civilization that remembers everything cannot be surprised. And a civilization that cannot be surprised cannot be defeated by the same wound twice. The tesserae learned that. They came back expecting ruins and found a world that had been watching the corridor they left through for longer than their own recorded history. They found a world that knew their drive signatures better than they did. They found a world that could recite the names of the people their ancestors had killed in order, with duty assignments and last transmissions, 30,000 years after the fact. I do not know what they will do with that knowledge. I do not know if they will return again. The file says the probability is low but non-zero, and the file is patient. And if they come back in another 30,000 years, someone will be sitting in a room like this one, watching the corridor, maintaining the record. The file will be open. The names will be there. The memory will be waiting, the way it has always waited, the way the desert waits. Not because it has forgotten what it holds, but because it has not. The sand does not bury memory. It keeps it dry. I finished my shift, walked outside into the evening light, and stood at the edge of the Adhem flat with the sky turning dark above me and the lattice stations beginning to glow in the high distance. Somewhere out there, beyond the system boundary, 63 ships were running for home, carrying with them the knowledge that Earth had never stopped watching, never stopped counting, never stopped holding the names of the dead in a living file maintained by living hands. 30,000 years, 1,142 generations, 412 analysts on the tesserae file alone, and one old man in a desert watching the last light of a day that his predecessors had spent their entire careers waiting for. I did not feel victorious. I did not feel triumphant. I felt the weight of every year that had gone into the watch, and the weight of every name in the file, and the quiet, exhausting pride of belonging to a species that had looked at the worst thing that had ever happened to it and said, "We will not forget this. We will hold it, and we will be ready." The stars came out. The lattice stations tracked silently overhead. The desert held its silence, the way it always has, the way it always will, full and patient and unbroken.